Who gets to have your head after you've died?
I don't know, like...
Is there a queue is what I'm asking?
No, I don't know, like give it to the Rosicrucian Church or something. I feel like...
What do they want with it?
I don't know, but I feel like they'll turn it into some sort of relic.
You hope so.
Yeah, like, you know, the human body is quite wasted in death. I don't know, bury me and bury like a tree stump above me. You know, do something.
We're going to start a kind of reliquary cult of you. Okay.
Yeah,
I can make that happen.
Yeah.
If you predecease me, I'll make that happen for you, Thomas.
I doubt that's going to happen. I do have like nearly 15 years on you, so
yeah, maybe.
Yeah,
I'm vegan though. That must give me a few extra years.
I mean, you're having all those chemicals from the fake vegan foods.
This is true.
Yeah. I'm eating all natural. I'm on the hog.
You're on the hog.
Yeah, I'm on the hog. Bismillah.
I read that about you somewhere.
Yeah, I'm sure you did. You're very welcome to this in-person version of Beneath the Skin. Matt has just talked for 3 hours prior to this, so if he... I'm
just getting warmed up, baby.
I don't think that will slow him down. You're Beneath the Skin, the show about the history of everything, told through the history of tattooing. I'm one of your co-hosts, Thomas O'Mahony, and I'm joined as ever by my esteemed co-host, Dr. Matt Lauder. And we have a guest in person in studio.
Live and in charge.
Matt, would you like to introduce our guest?
I would. So we've had a hectic week here in Beneath the Skin Towers with visitors from the United States, the other one of whom you will be hearing on the show as well. But this week, in the run up to Christmas, someone I've never met before, but who I have a lot of mutual friends and contacts with.
You also kind of look like each other as well.
Yeah, I don't know. I'll take it. He's a good-looking man. Is the man sitting next to me, Ethan Hill. Welcome to Beneath the Skin. Welcome to London.
Thank you so much for having me on the show. What a surreal experience, but thank you.
Exactly. Yep. So Matt. Yep. So
good.
Pick up on Mitch McConnell.
So yeah, Ethan is a photographer, filmmaker, has a storied career as a photojournalist. We were talking earlier on about you photographing Mitch McConnell, of all people.
Yeah, I used to work with Newsweek as a freelancer.
Yeah.
That was like a lovely gig for 11 years. And they always gave me the most horrific Republican, the top horror show people.
That's how they get you. But what we want to talk to you about today, and the reason you're over is because you're doing some more work on a film you're working on about someone I think some people listening will have heard of, some who may have heard of but not know much about, and some who will never heard of at all. And that is a man by the name of Tattoo Mike Wilson, the second chapter in Modern Primitives, which
famously
is
not in the Beach Boys.
Not in the Beach Boys. Maybe he was. Maybe that's the same guys.
He didn't. Mike Wilson from the Beach Boys didn't actually drown looking for his wallet.
No, he performed as a tattooed man at Coney Island.
Yeah, there you
go. But Ethan, I mean, you can tell us all about the project. You're making a film about Mike's life, and when you contacted me to talk about it, I said I really didn't know much about Mike other than what I'd read in Modern Primitives. So I don't know, maybe like tell us about the project, and then really just start to tell us about Mike. And I'd love to talk, pick your brains about him and his life and his legacy.
Yes. So I started. This is the first film I've ever made. I've never done this before. I think in terms of cliches, I'm probably living the cliche as hard as you can live it. Just this started off as a 4-minute YouTube idea. Hey, wouldn't it be so great to be able to go and talk to important living artists, important living collectors, and try to present some kind of really smart, thought out presentation of what's going on with tattooing today. I chose Michael because Michael was a teenage hero of mine. I had first seen a photograph of him made by a guy named Len Prince in New York. So this photograph, it sort of hit on, I think I was 15 or 16 years old. For starters, it was a gorgeous studio image. It was lit beautifully. And to see that kind of crazy tattooing treated with such visual reverence hit all of my buttons instantly. It was also a pretty queer image. Michael is embracing the body of another man who is unidentified in the photograph. As it turns out, the other person is Robert Sherman, who was Robert Mapplethorpe's white alopecia model. Ken Moody was the other alopecia model. So Len is in those circles. He was part of those circles. And it's Robert Sherman's blank, hairless, unidentifiable back with Michael's arms embracing him in this glorious sort of like 80s studio light. And because I was so interested in photography already, I was like, that's for me. And to see that kind of heavy tattooing, which I had never seen before as this young boy, thinking not only is he the most beautiful man I've ever seen, the thought was, he is the most beautiful creature I have ever seen. And how quickly can I look like that? And that was how it started.
Where did you see the picture?
Printed on a postcard at the mall.
No.
The poster shop at the mall.
Incredible.
In the suburbs.
Also just such a incredible, we're talking 80s, 90s?
The picture must have been late 80s, I think. And I would have seen it late 80s or early 90s.
It's an incredibly late 80s, early 90s story. But I would assume like that kind of, and this is me being a photography nerd, like that juxtaposition of the, I suppose, the purity of the pale, hairless body in contrast with this like heavily tattooed, figure is just like, I couldn't understand how moving that would be.
It was a shocker. I mean, certainly for that period of time.
Where was the mall?
San Mateo, California, down the peninsula. Yeah, I was living with my father at the time. I was in high school, early high school. So Michael was a longtime hero of mine. And the idea for the film was, it started with this YouTube idea. And I thought maybe I could just do these shorts. I don't know how to edit. I don't know anything. I can compose. That's it. I can light and I can compose. And I went to see Dick Zigun, who is the founder of Coney Island, USA. This is the nonprofit arts organization in Coney Island that puts on the Sideshow and has done since the foundation started, I think, in 83. By 85, they had the building and started Sideshow performances in an extremely limited sort of capacity. I'd be happy to explain more if that's interesting. By 87, Michael is it's the first full season, and Michael is a performer there. And Dick was my very first interview. I had no idea what I was doing. I just knew he worked there. I wrote blindly to the email and I said, hey, I don't know. I think I'm working on a movie about Mike Wilson. Can I speak with someone? When Dick responded and we did this interview, during which he said, well, Michael was a painter. And, Michael had crazy diabetes, like from the age of 10 on. And, Michael was bisexual. And this, that, and the other. And I thought, well, okay, I guess this isn't going to be 5 minutes anymore. This will be, there's a lot to explore.
So, Paul King and I talked a lot about this when we talked about Ethel Granger, who was a woman, of course, who got, who became a mimetic image for her tiny waist, but for whom the real complexity and humanity of her story was completely effaced by the version of her that was the kind of head punchline in the newspaper. And it's not quite the same for Michael, but of course, like that kind of story where people who are famous, as I said, really what I knew of Michael's life was the 3 pages in Modern Primitives. Like that is, of course, a very limited version of anyone's story, let alone someone as necessarily complex as someone who's going to look and perform and be like that at that time.
You raise a really good point. Let me just explain what the approach has been, which is I went into this sort of understanding that, I'm 52 now. I got tattooed the day after my 18th birthday by Suzanne Fauger. based on that famous Suzanne Faucher back tiger that was circulating in all of the magazines in the 80s. But essentially, I realized that I was a community virgin in so much as I really love tattooing, but I was not engaged. So my approach to be as respectful as I thought I could be was I wanted to put my position as the kid after school who goes to the library and just sits down and keeps his mouth shut and listens to a story being told. The way that worked really well was that Michael's story is pretty much totally unwritten. So I knew this was an opportunity. You also mentioned something earlier. Some of you may know him, some of you may not. For my period and my experience, he was such a overwhelming phenomenon, and it's become crystal clear to me at this point that he is really endangered of being forgotten, and he is being forgotten. And I hope this will just sort of like put a bookmark in for him.
Mm-hmm. And I think, interestingly, in comparison to Ethel Granger, like the lives of people who I suppose lived as a perceivable public object through their body is a very interesting story. But similar to Ethel Granger, yeah, there is like seeing the person beyond the kind of public oddity, either self-made or otherwise. And I think, now I'll admit I don't know a huge amount about Mike, but that's something that I suppose maybe we should touch on now, is like the person beyond the like heavily tattooed person, the man with head and face tattoos in the 80s in New York, that was this kind of public oddity and performer, but also a person and an artist beyond that.
Yeah. I'll take one step back and say my approach to the whole thing was that if there was a thread, I pulled on it. I would talk to anybody that would give me any information. The idea for the film is a personal life story. It's an autobiography. So all of that personal stuff was really critical to be a part of. But you can't ignore the tattooing and the culture and the illegality that was going on during New York during that period of time. So to sum up Michael in some capacity, he got tattooed for the first time at 17 or so. He grew up in Marin County, just across the bridge, the Golden Gate Bridge from San Francisco. His mother, he grew up in a pretty terrible family. He had one older brother with a father who just psychologically pit every family member against the other.
He was born in the late 50s, early 60s?
52.
52, wow.
Yeah, he was born in 52.
Amazing.
Richard, I think, was 1 or 2 years older than him. The brothers mended it was a situation that it kind of destroyed their relationship their whole life, and it just mended quickly, sort of right before Michael died. At 10, Michael was diagnosed with acute brittle diabetes and was insulin dependent from 10 on. And there is a story, his mother says that this was not true, but there is a story that the doctors told him, well, if you really take good care of yourself, you're going to be dead by the time you're 25. And if you don't take good care of yourself, you'll die sooner. So take this information as you will. I'm using this as sort of a frame up for, if you have nothing to lose in your life, you might as well go for it. I can give you one really fascinating line that Clayton Patterson, who ran the New York Tattoo Society of New York, gave me. Michael approached him during the ban in New York from 61 to 97. I'm also sort of using the ban as the perfect storm scenario for Michael to achieve what he wanted to do, because no one would touch him on the West Coast. No one would touch his face on the West Coast. So he came to an underground community where if you had the cash, you could get done what you wanted. So Clayton Patterson said Michael was coming to him to look for somebody to get his face tattooed. And Michael's line was, I'm not really interested in getting my face tattooed. I'm interested in becoming the illustrated man.
Yeah.
And I think as I've understood the time frame, this was in 1983. That kind of heavy tattooing was so unpopular during that period of time in terms of public display. I marvel at his ability. You and I spoke earlier about the right context of time for your rebellion to matter and register. And Michael did this with no sideshow to join. American Sideshow had died by that point. The only shows that were traveling were basically putting on paper mache fake displays because that was really all. The live shows had died out by that point. So
and this is the time, as you alluded to, that tattooing was trying to be in the late 70s, early 80s was trying to go legit, to put it simply. Like Ed Hardy was publishing Tattoo Time. There'd been that schism that we talked about on the show before, where the mainstream of the tattoo industry wanted to project a good version of itself. There was a lot of facial tattooing happening in London, but it was very ostracized. It was on young skinhead kids. It was quite predatory, actually. It wasn't illegal over here, but it was certainly kind of policed by the community itself as something undesirable, because the mainstream of the industry wanted to tell a particular version of itself that was, protectionist and stuff. And so I think it's really interesting and almost ironic that it needed the illegality and in order for in a way, it's sort of this is the thing that the people on the West Coast and in London feared was going to happen. If it wasn't banned, or that the ban would lead to.
And also parallels between the two. If you look at photography from the time, the vast majority of people who had facial tattooing were like street kids, punks, who were like being tattooed by a very small handful of people in London.
Yeah.
Probably two people.
Yeah, two people in London, yeah.
One person that we will not name for various reasons. But yeah, if you look at photography from LA at the time, anyone who had facial tattoos was like LA punk street kids.
Isn't it so funny? The nightmare came true.
So he does he sort of, I mean, I guess it's an easy and romantic dilution of the story, but does he sort of go to New York to sort of join the circus? As you said, the circus didn't exist in a way, but
no, he chose he wanted to become this illustrated man for a society that had no place for him yet.
Yeah.
And then 85 happens. He joins the cast in 87, which is the first full season that the Sideshow at Coney Island runs, which is still going to today. And he becomes a star. And it's before Jim Rose starts. So in 84, Cirque du Soleil has its birth. In 85, Coney Island starts. I mean, the time frame is that close. The magic with what happened at Coney Island, John Bradshaw is an old showman. He was the youngest of the old generation of showmen, and a guy named Steve Zeitlin, who worked at the Smithsonian, had put on in 81. I'm not going to say the year correctly, but in the very early 80s, they put on a sideshow and medicine show in the Great Lawn, where all of the national monuments are, because it was a dying art form. And they wanted it recorded before all of the old timers left. Steve moves to New York. He meets John Bradshaw at that event. Steve moves to New York. He's a folklorist. And in 85, he's on the board of Coney Island, USA. He makes the introduction of Dick Zigun, who is the president of the thing. And John Bradshaw has all of the connections. So he brings Melvin Burkhart, the anatomical blunder,
such a good name,
who pioneers the Blockhead Act. He creates it, right? Or he's the one. And he brings Otis Jordan, the Human Cigarette Factory. Those are the old timers. Otis actually sued in New York for the right to work as a, quote unquote, other-bodied disabled person and won. I choose this job. And Michael was the new blood. It was Michael who was super handsome, a movie star handsome, and a snake charmer named Ruby Rodriguez, who was a hairstylist from the Bronx, who was super hot and danced with the snake. And Dick says it was the merger of the old school and the new school that made the whole thing really successful.
What was Michael's act? I mean, did he have a background in theatre and performing? And
the ridiculous, I've asked because he grew up in San Francisco during the period of time when the Angels of Light and the Cockettes, so the Cockettes, famous trans and gender fuck sort of performance group, starts out of the hippie period of time. The Angels of Light, there was one lead queen named Hibiscus who ends up moving to New York, and then the group kind of disbands and reforms as the Angels of Light. And Michael was very involved. He lived with one of the performers. They did this underwater thing, and Michael helped paint some of the animation cells that were projected during that period of time. So he was very exposed to that, but he never performed with them. He didn't. And it really surprised me, but he didn't.
Because I get asked this a lot, actually, and I often don't quite know how to answer it. People, when we're talking about people like Cosentino or, the performing tattooed man and woman as a trope in general, some people say to me about, like, what did they do? Like, what did they actually do? And you're like, well, I mean, they just sort of, the early ones, they did just stand there and people looked at them, Their act had to evolve, and that's where the storytelling comes in, and various other bits of clownery and performing in the case of Omi, for example, in the 20s and 30s. But people sort of say to me, like, what do they do? But as you said, just the spectacularness of it itself is enough. And there's an interesting, we were talking about this earlier, in that rebirth of Coney Island, they're actively playing with and reproducing and rebirthing and referring to the very famous cultural memory of 20s and 30s, or even 1880s and 90s sideshow and circus performing, right? It's almost it's this very nostalgic reimagination and reinvention of the form.
Michael stripped.
Yeah.
Basically, he would come out in a variety of different costumes that would change seasonally. The Scarecrow one was the freakiest looking one. Crazy, like, serial killer burlap bag outfit with a hood. And basically he would give the most truncated history of tattooing while he stripped so that he could show you his tattoos. Right. And then he would do this little act. It was when MC Hammer was really big. And, oh God, it's Hammer time. And he would do this little, he would do this little line that said, "Ladies," and he would grab this little hammer and stick it behind his ear so his ear would sort of stick out to the audience, and he would say, "If you're tired of your husband flapping his gums, I'll tell you a really simple remedy for this. Go to the hardware store and get yourself a nail. Then grab yourself any old hammer. Any old hammer will do." And then he would proceed to lay his tongue out on a board and hammer. He would do the Pain-Proof Man act. And it was so shocking and weird that I was able to find this out. But Sean Vasquez was the person who pierced Michael's tongue.
Really?
Sean was a piercer for 4 seconds of time before
he's a tattooer.
He's an amazing, really, amazing really tattooer. And he gave Michael his whole act.
Wow. I didn't know that.
And one part of the story of Michael is that he always struggled to improve. We were talking earlier today about this idea of the act wearing out, right? And it really did.
Yeah.
Ward Hall, the famous sideshow man, has always said, "I'm not going to have a fat person in the audience in my show anymore because half the audience looks like my performer. Yeah. I can't have a tattooed person because half my audience looks like 80% of my audience looks like the guy performing on stage." And Michael really struggled with that because the tongue thing was really shocking for 2 years, and then it became less and less and less.
And then everyone starts getting tongue piercings, and
They were.
yeah,
And
that's so interesting.
It's all Sean Porter's fault.
No,
Sean,
it's Paul King's
it's
fault.
Paul King and Sean.
Sean
People-
Vasquez.
Oh,
Sean Vasquez.
Yeah.
it's just like, you know.
And Sean Porter.
And Sean
And Sean
Porter, yeah.
Porter's like, they didn't know we could split your tongue, and all the circus performers are all out of work now.
Yeah.
It's all BME's
That's another thing
fault.
for him to keep him up at night to worry about that. What's Michael's life like off the stage? Like, how's he living in New York as a man with very heavily tattooed face at a time when tattooing itself is not unusual, but it's not as visible as it is now? And, you know, what's his offstage life like at this time?
It's really quiet. So Michael always had disability because of his diabetes. He lived off disability ever since he left home. And at a certain point, Michael had started working at the Sideshow, but at a certain point he ended up in a homeless shelter, which was and working at the Sideshow at the same time.
Is it such seasonal money and, like, you know, really not a huge amount of money?
Yeah. So
I mean, New York's also like a tough place to be in the 80s, right? Like, it's a difficult time for the whole city.
financially, the crack was awful during that period of time. The drug violence was awful during that period of time. And there's a story, as I said, you know, I'm just kind of going with what I've been told, but there's a story. Everybody thought it was a good idea that Michael get into low-income housing so that he would be secure for his whole life. He ended up in a project building on the end of 17th Street, and that worked out very well for him. But those lists are years and years long. So he got hooked up with a gay case manager who had a crush on him and fast-tracked his case. So he, like, within a couple of months, he was able to get in, and not 15 years. And the way they needed to do it was that Michael needed to prove homelessness, and he needed to prove an extreme case. The tattooing was one part of that argument. I can't get a job because my face is tattooed. And the other part of it was to prove extreme scenario, and that was homelessness. So he ended up in a Salvation Army shelter. Oh God, what is the name of the movie? I'm not going to remember it. Up in the old, the Sunshine Hotel, I think is what it's called.
Yeah.
But the Bowery in New York had tons of these bum hotels and bum bars.
Had done for a century.
A
Right.
century.
Really important hub for tattooing for that exact reason, because it was where all the drunken sailors used to stay on shore. Flop houses and bars and, you know, speakeasies and stuff. Yeah.
He was in a Salvation Army, which I think was co-ed by Floor, and so he did his time, and then he was able to get in there. He was a collage artist. He was a painter.
Wow.
And his whole ambition for his whole life was just to be an artist. There's a small little story about him taking a trip when he was still living in California with his friend Jamie. She had family up in Canada, and Michael got detained at customs, and she went to go pick him up. And she said, they interviewed her and said, the customs agent, will you be responsible for this guy? This guy's on unemployment. Will you pay his bills if he incurs any debt? Blah, blah, blah. And she said, what does he do? They asked her, what does he do? And she said, nothing. He's on unemployment. And Michael was really upset when they let him out. And he said, why did you say that? Why didn't you tell them that I'm an artist?
Yeah.
And that was really what he held on to in terms of his identity.
Yeah. So did he ever consider tattooing himself, picking up a tattoo machine?
He consciously said he would never tattoo.
Yeah.
Which I actually found quite interesting.
Yeah.
He wanted to be a painter.
Amazing. Did many of his works survive? Because it was a really interesting time to be an artist in New York. I mean, there's lots happening. Keith Haring's around at that time, of course, and like Andy Warhol's still alive. Well, just about still alive. Basquiat's around. Yeah, like an interesting time to be around the New York art scene. although difficult to crack that nut if you're an outsider, sort of carny sideshow guy.
Super interesting time. I think it's part of Michael's psychology to set himself up for failure. I think that was part of the problem.
I find people like that, like Sam Stewart comes to mind actually, topmost, but there's a few people we've talked about in the program and people that we've looked at, like this kind of self-sabotage, or like people who are like smarter and more resourceful than their circumstances permit them to be at the moment, are kind of a constant. There's something about people like that and creating enough of a wave in history, particularly in these subcultural histories, but I think more generally too.
To quantify that statement, I'll say that Michael was offered several opportunities, one by an extremely important, art world kingmaker, right? Royalty maker. And the setup was, Michael, I'll give you a show. I would like 15 or 20 paintings. And you have 6 months to produce. And he simply couldn't do it. He was friends with a woman named Karen, who was sort of, she is a dominatrix, but she was also an art making partner with him. They had a very good friendship, and she was trying to troubleshoot the whole thing. We can borrow these pieces; they're just not going to be for sale. And that wasn't the first opportunity. There were others, and he just simply couldn't do it. The paintings, there's probably maybe 10 that survive. There are 2 books of like a collage sketchbook. The address, interestingly enough, in one of them that's listed is the Salvation Army shelter address. If this book is lost, please return to 225 Bowery. And then there were the formal collages. And the paintings, again, are so fascinating because many of them have multiple figures in them. There is no space in terms of environment that's identifiable. And the figures are all Michael over and over and over again.
Self-portraitures to some degree, yeah.
In multiple figures.
Wow.
And so he had an ex-boyfriend named Jack, and he talked to Jack about like the representations of these figures. He said, some of those are, so for example, some might be covered in pimples, some are tattooed, some are not tattooed. And he called the pimpled characters, they're my diseased boys. And these were all his own, for greater or lesser detail, his own face. And they're all talking to each other. And the paintings are really quiet. And I so love the mystery of never knowing what those conversations were. And this is a part of, as I've been trucking along with the film, this is also something, you mentioned this idea of the environment of Warhol and Basquiat and the entire East Village scene, David Armstrong and David Wojnarowicz and Nan Goldin and all of these really critically important people, McDermott and McGough, who Michael was photographed by, Andy Warhol, who Michael was photographed by. I'm just trying to now understand, as a person who chose to not participate, where Michael's artwork fits into that period of time for that city. I did ask his boyfriend, Bill, Michael as an outsider artist, and Bill said, no. Michael knew exactly what he was doing. He was very much a part of that scene. He said, in my opinion, I feel like it's very inappropriate to categorize Michael as an outsider artist at all. Mm-hmm. He's not Henry Darger. He's Michael in New York City. It feels
like this is quite a nerdy historical thing to say, but he also seems to really fall between 2 schools of what's happening artistically in New York at that time. Because you've got I'm just thinking about Valerie Solanas, right, who is this nexus point in some senses. Because on the one hand, you've got the kind of by that point quite established pop art Basquiat, Haring to a lesser degree scene where, yes, it kind of comes from some kind of subculturally authentic place, but by this point it's quite commercialized, or beginning to be. And Valerie Solanas is the nexus point there, who is friends with and part of the group of Black Mask and Up Against the Wall Motherfucker and the anarchists and the sort of the anti-Warholian art scene, who are doing kind of Dada inspired performance and throwing things at Salvador Dali's exhibitions and things. And, and in Solantis' case, shooting Andy Warhol. Right, which comes from a really kind of particular political, active, like anarchist tradition. And Michael's like neither this kind of mainstream, if you like, New York pop art version of 1980s New York, but he's also not kind of like the anti-Warholian, anarchist, surrealist, Dadaist, like rejectionist stuff either. Like he's somewhere in this sort of unappreciated middle artistically. That's such an interesting point. I mean, I guess the other thing that's happening in New York at the time as well is, of course, is HIV/AIDS and ACT UP and Gran whatever they're called, those guys, like all of the
gay men's health crisis.
Yeah, gay men's health crisis. All of the much more kind of didactic political art about HIV/AIDS, and all the very confessional versions of that Wojnarowicz was doing and stuff. And again, it doesn't sound like Michael's work really fits into any of the dominant modes of our New York art in that moment in the 80s.
It doesn't, but you do raise you spark a really interesting idea. I did talk to Bill at length about this because Bill had a whole career in the art world, the very high level art world. So he had a pretty good appreciation of what had gone down. And he was the one who said, you really can't put him you can't categorize him as an outsider artist. But there's a friend, Monty Coleman, and sex comes up in conversation a lot. And Monty proposed a theory that perhaps the painting was a means for Michael. It was the expression of his sex life. Michael was a giant flirt. Michael slept with not very many people. He flirted with everybody. And it was part of his charisma and it was part of his attraction, but he really didn't sleep around. And Monty proposed a theory that maybe the act of creating these paintings was the manifestation of his, not only a sexual expression, but it was his sex life. And as a concept, I find this is fascinating to me. Fascinating.
I don't want to get to, I could get really deep and nerdy with the art history here, but I wanted to quote something from the interview with Michael in Modern Primitives, where he's asked, after you had, which I think leads in, Andrew Juno says, after you had your face tattooed, did the world change? And Michael says, it changed radically. With my hands tattooed, I could still get away with things. When my face got tattooed, I couldn't get away with anything. I was a marked man most of the time. I liked it. But it does get in the way, such as when I'm looking for work. I like the tattoos themselves. I thought about them carefully and chose the tattoos I wanted. I like meeting people with my tattoos. It's a weird bridge to meeting people. Sometimes I'll meet people in a kind of odd way. But what I don't like is the obvious. I'm in theatre 24 hours a day when I'm in public. And of course, you get asked obvious questions over and over again, right? And that seems to me such an interesting thing of like the antisocial move is a pro-social act, but it also gets exhausting. I mean, Eric Sprague, who the Lizard Man, latterly a Coney Island performer who's tattooed green. I've walked around Camden with him, a place in London that's very used to eccentricity, and people literally stop and stare at him. So even in this day and age, being visibly tattooed in that way is disruptive, affective to the world, and it's exhausting, right? It's joyful and it's creates opportunity, but it's exhausting. And I wanted to quote there because it seems like Michael, even there in 1989, still is wrestling with this hybridity of being in the middle of something, creating something around him, even perhaps, but also being at the edge of it, and that being itself, a generation of something paradoxical. Like he can't be inside or outside because of the way he's made himself be in the world. I think that's such an interesting thing.
It's like, it's confronting and staring disharmony in the face in a way that pushes you to the periphery, whether you want it or not. It's,
but the periphery is a place for you and it gives you a space to be somehow.
Yeah, it's creating space for yourself through like undertaking this like while pro-social, inherently transgressive act that is like so aggressively antithetical to like harmony in a public space, because like you can tattoo your hands and you can wear gloves, but like people aren't looking at your hands when they're talking to you.
No.
They're looking at your face. And if like the face you're presenting to them is so confronting to their perceptions about public life, that is...
Well, this is something really interesting in tattoo history more generally, right? Because a lot of the Cook myth about tattooing being discovered in the Pacific is actually about Cook being surprised by the facial tattooing on Maori people. And even Immanuel Kant, right, the German philosopher, basically says, like, I love all, I mean, again, I'm paraphrasing, but like, I love all that decorative stuff that the Maori do, but why are they doing it on their face? Like, the history of the heavily tattooed face, like, is, and it's the reason that people that are referencing those histories, like Michael, like Omi, like Eric, are doing it in the first place, is this kind of layering of history. But the changing of the face and the modification of the face and the messing up of the face is like the ultimate act, you know, the ultimate act.
And it's interesting you say that, like, pointing out that his paintings are like quiet and introspective in a way that isn't, it's looking at the interiority of yourself without it becoming solipsistic or kind of this like, oh, in love with your own art. It's like very plaintive and very quiet and like examining aspects of yourself that I suppose when you do tattoo your head in the way Mike did, it really forces you to figure out who you are, because you cannot hide behind a face anymore.
Ironically, you're wearing the mask, but you have to be yourself.
All right, Kafka.
Yeah.
So Charles Gatewood, the photographer, basically, I was gifted this video interview that I don't think anybody has ever seen. That was shot with Michael in his apartment, and Charles asks Michael, you know, why, and why, what is this? Why did you do your face? And Michael even struggles to define that himself. And he says it has something to do with mask and mask making. And I don't know how to explain it any further than that.
Wow.
He thought about it for a while. There's a long pause in the film. And he said, I don't know how to define it.
Yeah, I say often that I find why questions not the most uninteresting, really, but certainly the most inscrutable. I tend to sort of avoid them a lot of the time in my own research practice, because it's like I'm more interested in what the faces and what the bodies do in the world than why people do it.
And I think the better question is why not? Why don't you tattoo your face?
Brilliant. That's a really good point. I mean, I think, like, you know, with his face in particular, maybe this is the next thing I wanted to ask you about, Ethan, is like his face. Yeah, that's why I'm. Yeah. So, so this is the next thing I wanted to ask you, right? So his face becomes really iconic. He becomes, so he's in Modern Primitives, and then he's photographed by or for Jean-Paul Gaultier, and becomes, you know, Gaultier becomes this absolutely iconic. You know, he becomes really famous for his use of tattooing and this bringing of what is read in the 90s as this subcultural practice to the mainstream. You know, for reasons we've talked about on the show before, not entirely novelly, but like, can you talk a bit about how that happens, like, and what happens to his life after then?
Nothing. Yeah. It didn't change. Yeah. But it did for me personally. I mean, I think seeing those images more and more and more, I wanted to see him. He was like my Hollywood super actor crush. And he appeared lots of other places. So in the fine art world, you know, aside from Andy Warhol photographing him, he was also photographed by Marcus Leatherdale. He was photographed by Amy Arbus, the daughter of Diane Arbus, who made the quintessential Jack Dracula portrait, which I found so ironic that, you know, I think she committed suicide Diane did in the 70s, but like that full circle of being photographed by the daughter then. He was photographed by McDermott and McGuff, very famous sort of to this day 80s art scene, art making couple. So he was photographed on this very high end level outside of the Len Prince image. And he appeared in music videos.
He did a Bruce Springsteen video, right?
Bruce Springsteen video, Tunnel of Love, with some of the other sideshow performers. And he also appeared in Lisa and the Cult Jam video, Let the Beat Hit 'Em, which is actually, to see Michael, it's a much nicer video because he dances in that,
Wow.
and he dances really well. And so he appeared, and he was friends with Kembra Fowler. So Kembra had him, he would perform with the voluptuous horror of Karen Black on stage sometimes. He would dress up and be the Eggman. And she had him in a video for the Mr. Twilight.
Karen Black, who's a performance artist, right? Yeah, who was like one of the NRA4 and a big part of the New York art scene that got really pissed off the Reagan administration, along with Ron Athey, slightly aside. But yeah, covered herself in chocolate quite a lot, didn't she? Was that her? One of them did.
I do remember one act, which is hard to talk about.
Do you know how Gaultier found him?
I don't.
No.
It's a total mystery to
Yeah.
me. Michael did do fashion stories. He did work as a fashion model.
Right.
So
he did sort of catwalk occasionally and model, and yeah.
I don't know if he ever did a catwalk, but he did perform. He did appear editorially.
Great.
So there was a magazine called Detour that it was a regular sort of smaller fashion magazine, and he had like a 6 or 8 page story in there
Wow.
that was like really nicely photographed. And so I don't know. I think I'm going to die not knowing the answer to that question, how Gaultier found him, but
Surely someone who listens to the show can ask him.
Well, maybe, yeah. Like Michael's been trying to get, Ethan's been trying to get in touch with them and find a way into the Gaultier people, and hasn't had any luck yet. But maybe we'll keep trying. So we'll lose it as well. And you know, Michael's life sadly ends not long after this moment, right? And ends sadly. But also in a way that he did talk about wanting to have his skin preserved. So maybe as we're coming to the end of the recording time that we've got, sadly short time we've got available, because I could talk to you for hours. Could we talk a bit about the end of his life and what his legacy has been since?
Do you want me to talk about the skin?
Okay.
So because Michael also primarily was a sideshow performer, there is truth and there is bullshit.
That's
and
what we love.
There's a gray line of bullshitty truth and truthy bullshit. I have a feeling. So Joel Peter Witkin, the photographer, photographed Melvin Burkhart, the anatomical blunder.
And Joel Peter Witkin's massively involved in the tattoo and piercing scene in ways that I didn't realise. He's photographed a lot of people and been around.
He photographed a lot of cadavers. I think as I've started to understand Michael's psychology, that I think there was some truth and there was some wishful thinking. When Modern Primitive came out, and when Ed Hardy discusses Dr. Fukushi in his chapter in Modern Primitive, a story started to go around Coney Island, and everybody sort of, the sideshow, everybody kind of understands that, you know, Michael discussed this and then nothing ever happened. But theoretically and apparently he was approached to sell his skin after he passed away.
As we talked about, a good story that several of his predecessors as people who made a living from being famous tattooed performers had also told that story. So I don't know if Michael was aware of that, but it was a good old trope that he was playing with. Yeah.
It's a trope. It's a fascinating line of bullshit. I wonder if there's any truth. I'm always surprised when I've totally dismissed a story and then it's sort of like, wait a minute.
Yeah.
A year later, it's like, no, that was real. The story. So Michael did not have his skin preserved. He was cremated, and Michael was a very, very spiritual person who experimented a lot with various formal structures of religion and spirituality, and switched gears a lot over his life to experience lots of different things. It's half funny and maybe it's half of a truth that Michael chose to not, the story goes that Michael chose to not sell his skin, particularly to a private collector, because he didn't want to go the route of like a rhinoceros horn and be ground up for someone else's erection. So Michael
Come by the powder of a tattooed man.
Yeah. So Michael would not have been into that, and it was very specific that was, I mean, it's all a line of bullshit, but who knows? Maybe he might have mentioned this off the cuff to somebody.
But it's beautiful and meaningful, and as I said, kind of historically inflected in a really interesting way, and speaks to something both of its moment, as you said, like Ed, I hadn't put that time together, but you're right, Ed had published Life and Death Tattoo Time around that time and talked about Fukushi, and it was in the air in the tattoo world in a way. I love that. I love those conversations. It's so fascinating.
Oh, it's endlessly fascinating. So Michael died at the age of 44 from the diabetes.
Oh my God.
And what happened? So he ended up in that apartment on 17th Street, and those buildings have they have poured cement floors. He lived in a very tiny studio, and he never did take care of himself physically. He always he drank too much, not a good combination with the diabetes and the blood sugar.
Performing life.
Isn't there a hashtag for that on Instagram? Basically, I know I've been able to track the last person he met, which was Todd Robbins, the glass eater from the Sideshow. They had lunch together, and the whole conversation was about the future. The nailing the tongue to the board had worn out. Michael was desperate for a new act. He wanted to stay relevant. He wanted to continue doing this job. And he wanted to be a better draw. Todd has a million ideas, and they were really good friends. So they go and have lunch. The ideas, flow. Hey, Michael, we'll get together Monday or Tuesday and start rehearsing. He had a friend, Alice Moore at the time was her name. They had a regular date to go look at galleries together, and he didn't show up. Saturday morning, Jack, his ex-boyfriend, they had broken up a while ago, was working for God's Love We Deliver, which is the David Geffen AIDS Meals on Wheels program. And Jack was volunteering there, and Michael had said, maybe I'd like to come and help prepare food. And so they were going to do that together, and Michael didn't show up. And Jack calls and says, fuck you, Michael. You always do this to me. You say you're going to do something, and then you never show up. Fuck you. And then Alice gets really worried, and messages have been left, and there's no callback. And she ends up going to see his apartment. She goes by because she had a key, and he had died. And essentially what had happened is that he went into shock, and he fell out of the chair that he was sitting in and hit his head on the concrete floor, and he bled out from a very minor wound that really should not kill anybody, but he was unconscious. And if someone was there to scoop him up, he would have been fine. You do raise a really interesting point about the face getting old, and the not the face, but the reaction and the question and the question and the question. Did it hurt? Did it hurt? Why did you do that? And from someone being told that he was going to be dead by 25 and sort of living with that expectation, and then getting to 44, it was a lot of extra time. And I know he was really exhausted at that point. So because he was found alone, the police came in and needed to treat it like a suspicious death, and everything was ruled copacetic. It was cleared. The door was locked from the inside.
This was 1996.
It was 1996.
Yeah.
96. And that was it. And then he just kind of quietly went into the ether.
Yeah. Amazing. I mean, as someone who is 44 myself, and who, I got on, I think I probably read Modern Primitives in about 1996, 1995. I got on the internet for the first time in 1995, and got on Rector Arts at Body Art on Usenet, and that was, things were changing then, actually. That world, particularly the piercing, and kind of, just I said 1 year before the tattoo ban was lifted in New York, and the world was changing, and he was a big part of the reason it had changed in a way. His face being out there is one of the things that makes the world a different place, I think, into that period of the late 1990s, early 2000s, and he wasn't around to see it, sadly. But
I think it's so ironic, although apparently it means nothing. I just find it ironic that he died the year before legalization went through.
Yeah.
He died in 96.
He couldn't have existed in a post-legalization world.
I really wonder if he could not. I've harped on it, and everyone has said it wouldn't have mattered to him. He was just his own thing. He was a unique thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a perfect point to ended. And obviously, Ethan, thank you so much for coming on the show. It's been such an incredible episode. Where can people find you and find your work and find the documentary when you finish it?
The film has a website, tattoomikefilm.com. And I'm actually in the process of finishing up the interviews and then starting to write and cut. So the whole thing has been educationally totally uphill because I've never made a movie before. So I'm a little bit slow, but it's going forward. Yeah.
Okay. And as always, thank you to everyone who listens to the show and supports it. For anyone listening, books are in the post. Matt his fingers are falling off from signing all of them.
Yeah.
We've more on the way. We
had
have
a little bit of a supply chain issue, but that is being resolved as we speak.
Yes, and by the time you're hearing it, will be resolved.
Yeah.
So thank you very much for listening, and it's goodbye until next time.